How's it going, everyone? My name is Aman, CEO and co-founder of Casely. Today, I am joined by my esteemed colleague, Fahim Rahman, who is actually also my co-founder. So Fahim is an attorney. He is a law firm owner specializing in employment law. But Fahim, if you just want to give a quick intro of your background, that'd be great.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Fahim Rahman. I am the principal attorney and only attorney of the law office of Fahim Rahman. We specialize in plaintiff-side employment law. We take cases all over California. Um, yeah, before I did that, I guess it's kind of like a reverse chronological order. Before I started my firm, I worked for a few plaintiff side employment firms in LA. Before that, I was in law school at Loyola Law, shout out. And then before that, I worked in tech for about 5 years. And yeah, so I the cool thing about Casely is that I feel like I can use all of my skills that I've learned throughout my career in one place with the tech and the law. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Awesome, man. Appreciate that. So why don't we start from like the beginning, right? So, you're in tech and then you make this transition over to becoming a law firm owner. So I'm sure there's a lot that happened in between in your life. So like what was going in your mind when you were thinking of starting a law firm or even getting into law? Like why did you kind of go down this entrepreneurial route?
Yeah, I mean it probably even starts even before then. So I graduated. Well, I went to UC Irvine for my undergraduate degree in political science. I graduated in 2012. And 2012 was not the best time to graduate. It wasn't as bad as 28 or 2008, but we were still going through the recession, and it was a really tough time for people with liberal arts degrees, such as myself. And so I'd always wanted to go to law school, but at the time I was kind of scared of the debt, and so I didn't want. And the prospect for lawyers around that time was not the best. So I got into tech because there was just no other avenue at the time. I had an uncle who was working at tech, and he was like, "Hey, like, it seems to be the only field that's growing right now. So why don't you give it a shot?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." So I got into doing software quality assurance for some enterprise companies. That's how I got my foot in the door, and then I kind of worked my way up from being, a tester to being like a lead tester. And then I had to kind of make a decision on whether I wanted to go in the tech route or go to law school, which was kind of my original passion. And I was at that time, I had really good relationships with the support department and the DevOps department at my work. So it was kind of the fork in the road was kind of like, do I get more technical or do I go, to law school basically? So I decided to go to law school instead. I was kind of I always tell everybody this is kind of funny. It's like I was tired of sitting at a computer for the rest of my life, but now that's what I do. I got sick of sitting in front of a computer, and now I'm an attorney, and all I do is sit in front of a computer. So yeah, I mean that's how I went to. That's how I kind of got into law school.
Awesome. So maybe like let's say after you've kind of decided to go into law. Before we jump into that though, I'm curious like you're a law firm owner now. How large have you gotten it to? Like where are you at right now? What's the size? Anything you're comfortable sharing with to just get an idea of like where you're at with the business?
Yeah, so I've been at this I would say about 4 years now, maybe four and some change. And we have about 40 clients. We're a small team of three. I'm the only attorney, support staff. And yeah, I mean, it's things are going pretty good. It was definitely a struggle in the beginning, as all new businesses are, but I think we've kind of gotten over that hump with thanks to Casely, honestly.
Awesome. So why don't we jump into that, right? So you've got the law degree, you've gone through law school. Yeah, why did you want to start the firm, and then what were the kind of early days like?
Yeah, so I work for this firm. I'm not gonna name any names on this podcast,
Sure.
but so I worked for this firm while I was in school, and they were really cool. I liked working with them. They kind of taught me the mechanics of plaintiff side employment law, and I worked with them as a clerk, And then when I passed the bar, they gave me an offer that was really below market. Like it was just not a feasible offer. And so, if it wasn't for the compensation, I would have stayed there. But I just got married at the time. I just couldn't afford to take that. So I got another offer, a competing offer from a different firm, and so I changed to a different plaintiff-side employment firm. The thing is, like, the compensation was better there. The compensation package generally was better there, but everything else was worse. Like the mentorship was worse, the structure, just everything else was worse. After a while, I was like, you know what? I think I could do this myself. How hard could it be? Spoiler alert: it was really hard. But yeah, that's kind of my journey to making this decision.
And so, do you think, I mean, now you're kind of on the other side where you actually have like a successful firm. How important was it, do you think, for having that experience at an actual law firm before you just went off and started your own thing?
I would say it was important, but it wasn't a necessary condition. I would say you could do it without it. The thing is that when you work for a law firm, they only show you the mechanics and the procedural stuff of a case, and that's really helpful to know. But what they don't tell you and teach you is the business side, and that's kind of the secret sauce. Not necessarily secret sauce in that there's some big secret that they're hiding, but just like how to run a business, how cash flow is, like how to maintain cash flow, and then it really depends on your business model. For attorney's fees, there's pretty much like three ways that we can get paid. One of them is flat fee, one of them is an hourly billables, and the third is contingency. So, depending on what practice area you're in, that kind of that has an effect on what fee structure you can also use. But these are not things that people tell you when they're working at a firm, because you're getting a paycheck every month and you don't know why, where it's coming from. You don't care. And you don't care about the costs of running a business. And that's kind of the most important thing in running a firm or any business, I would say.
Right. Okay. So, once you kind of decided to strike out on your own, yeah, what were those early days like? Maybe like the first like 3 months, 6 months, first year. Like, how was life like for you making that adjustment?
It was it was really really hard. So most people kind of that I've talked to that have start their own firm, they usually have at least 5 to anywhere from 3 to 4, well, let's say 4 to 10 years of experience and a little bit of a nest egg. Some people have like $50,000. Some people have more than that. Some people have less than that, but generally around that. I had about like 4. So, I didn't really have a lot of runway because I was just, lawyers will understand this, but working in law firms they're generally pretty tough places to work. There's a lot of volume. There's not always a lot of like mentorship. It's kind of like you're thrown in the fire, you figure it out, or you don't. And so, I was at my last place, I was not getting enough mentorship. I was still pretty new to being an attorney, and I kind of knew what I was doing, but not enough. And the attorney I worked for, he wasn't really available because there's so many things. It's not really his fault. I mean, there's so many things in running a firm that he didn't really have the bandwidth to mentor me. And so, I kind of decided, I was like, well, you know what? I'm not really getting the kind of mentorship or training here. So might as well just get it on my own, find it on my own. So, I left, I started my firm. I joined this group for solo attorneys, and I got some good resources from them. But honestly, it was trial and error, just kind of figuring out what works. And I guess the hardest part, people would say, well, what is the hardest part? Well, the hardest part is always cash flow, honestly. And I had like a general idea about the law, and I knew employment law, but when you're first start off on your own, you're just like, okay, I'll take whatever. Like, just give me the clients. So, the clients started trickling in. I got one client. It was what was it? It was like a contract dispute. Somebody had gotten a collections notice from a business they had worked for. And that was my first client. So, I didn't know anything about that law or contract law or business law. So I had to research and figure everything out and, try to resolve that case. And, the hardest, well, not even the hardest thing. One of the most important things in the beginning is just learning, right? So finding the resources to learn. And I'm gonna shout out this book It's called Litigation by the Numbers. It's everything you really need to know about procedural civil cases in California. That book really helped me a lot. Just like, just the mechanics on like how to file, what you need to do to file a discovery. I think it's written by Julie Gorman. I don't want to butcher the name. Give me 1 second. But I'm definitely plugging this book. She's not paying me for or anything. But Litigation by the Numbers by Julie Gorin. Yeah, which that was a great book to learn kind of the procedure of civil law practice. So yeah, that was my first case. And backtracking a little bit, one of the things that I did want to do one of my motivations for going solo is that I wanted to do a bunch of different things. So when you're working for a firm, generally you're kind of dedicated to a practice area, and most firms kind of specialize in one practice area or maybe like two or three. And so, I was a new attorney. I was like, you know what? I want to learn everything. I don't want to be held back by anything. And so that was kind of the mindset that I went with in starting the firm. And so, I had this client, so I was learning how to do this business defense thing. And then I don't recall what was my next clients, but somewhere around there I got some like immigration clients. So I had to learn immigration, and I was able to, and I even got some like criminal clients. But I quickly figured out that being a generalist, or what's also known as law, is like being a door lawyer, which means like you just take any case that walks through the door. It's a really tough way to run a business. And the reason for that is that if you care about your clients, not all lawyers do, but if you care about your clients, you want to do the best job for them. And so you have to learn a new practice area every time you get a client in a different practice area. And that's not billable time. You can't make money for that. That's just, that's a sunk cost. And so, after about it took me about like a year and a half to learn this lesson. I couldn't figure out why I was so broke all the time. And part of the reason is because, I spent all of my time learning immigration law, learning contracts, learning, whatever, criminal law, and that's not things that I can build.
So you kind of realizes like if I actually niche down, it makes my entire operation stack a little bit more efficient. It makes my business a little more efficient because I'm not having to like waste my time learning new practice areas. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, so a constant theme in my life has been like I always learn everything the hard way, and so so I was really struggling, financially, and I didn't want to give up. And I know like a lot of people that I've seen, start the solo enterprise, they kind of go back to making, go back to working at a firm. And I was like, you know what? I told myself I was going to give myself 3 years to see if I could figure it out. Just do whatever I needed to do for 3 years. And if I can't do it in 3 years, then I'll go get a job. And luckily I have a very supportive wife, and she encouraged me to follow my dream instead of and she made a lot of sacrifices in that as well, so I really appreciate that. But so one of my like lowest points where I was just so broke and so stressed out, I was like, you know what, one thing that's always worked for me is to go back to reading. So I found some books about running a business. I did research. I found some books on like business. I found some books on like legal practice. And one of the books that really helped me was it's called Fireproof by Mike Morse. And Fireproof is basically it's Traction for lawyers. Now, Traction is like a very well-known business book written by Gino Wickman. And so Mike Morse actually hired Gino Wickman to help him run a very successful or scale into a very successful personal injury firm in Detroit, Michigan. But the thing is, like, as lawyers, we have certain rules we have to abide by. Like, for example, we can't solicit people. So we can advertise, but we can't solicit. So people have to reach out to us. And so then there's other rules like that. And so basically you can't use all of the things in Traction because of those guardrails. And so Fireproof, Mike Morse kind of like took the things that do apply, and most of them do because they're principles, and then got just really like honed it into a legal practice. So that book really, really changed the way I thought about business and the law. Another book was called The E-Myth by Michael Gerber. There's a series of books, E-Myth Plumber, E-Myth Doctor. So I found the E-Myth Attorney and I read that. So, and that represents like a huge turning point in me running my firm, because the lessons that I got from those books was that, I'm probably fine as an attorney, but I'm a terrible business owner. And those things are not hand in hand. And one idea in all of the e-myth books, is that most entrepreneurs that go into entrepreneurship, running a business, they're not entrepreneurs, they're technicians, trying to run a business. But when you become an entrepreneur, you have to kind of get out of that technician mindset. And so one of the practically one of the biggest lessons that I took from those books was to delegate. And so I found, the biggest fear in delegating is like, oh, can I afford to delegate? Right? Can I afford to, pay somebody a wage when I don't even know when my next dollar is coming from? But whatever I was doing wasn't working, because I was like so stressed out. I was like barely sleeping. I would hear, I remember this, like I would hear like the phone ring in my sleep, and like Outlook notifications, because I was losing my mind keeping track of stuff. And I was like, this is not gonna work. Like, this is terrible. And I'm so broke. Like why am I even doing this? So, I was like, all right, I'm gonna actually try to apply this lesson. And so I went out and, I hired somebody, and, that was kind of a game changer. So using the lessons that I took from E-Myth and Fireproof, I hired someone, and he still works with me today. So that was I would say like 3 years ago. And I was able to kind of delegate some stuff out to him, and it made my life a little bit easier. The money like started to you start to scale a little bit, right? Like my time doing like the really annoying things he did, that easy annoying things, he was able to take off my plate so I can focus more on business development. And another book that I read around this time is called The Pumpkin Plan. It's by Mike Michalowicz. And the basic premise of the Pumpkin Plan is that if you do one thing that, and he uses the analogy of a pumpkin, then you can grow a giant big pumpkin. Instead of, if you're trying to grow a bunch of fruits, you're gonna have like, some crappy apples and all this stuff, and maybe like, a smaller pumpkin. But if you focus all of your resources on like water and soil and fertilizer onto building the biggest, baddest pumpkin on your farm, you're going to get a good pumpkin. So that was when I was like, you know what? I'm going to go back to employment law. It's what I know best. And so I stopped doing other practice areas and started focusing just on employment law. But that came with its own issues, because employment law is an area of law that you do on contingency, which means that I don't get paid until there is a settlement. So, that meant there were some very, very rough months where I'm waiting for these cases to resolve. But, when it does resolve, like it's a decent amount, as opposed to when I was doing flat fee and hourly work. Sometimes, I had this one case, I was doing defending a business, and that's done on an hourly basis. And so I would send my bill to my client, and she would be like, "Oh yeah, I don't have any money this month. I can't pay you." And I was like, "What do you mean? I did this work for you. I don't understand." And she's like, "Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry. Like, I can't pay you this bill." And so, like, after that, I was like, "All right, no more billables." And so, that's the thing with the difference between that and the contingency. When you're doing employment law, you're suing people that have money, right? Like the number one unwritten rule of the law is like, you don't sue people that don't have money. There's just no point. And so, I had to really change my business model and thinking when I started to focus on employment law. But it was also taking a risk, right? Because you might not get paid. You might not get paid for a long time. So yeah, I mean, that's a long rambling answer to your question.
No, it makes sense. So it's kind of two threads, right? So you've kind of honed in on that niche of employment law, bit of a better market, bit of a better economics, and then the other thread is you kind of leveled up your own business skills. And so maybe kind of double clicking onto that second one, like from those books. Obviously, you said like delegating, hiring was like a big lever. What else did you kind of change in the business to really help on that side?
The other thing was kind of like templatizing. So, instead of writing everything from scratch, these books really emphasize creating templates to cut down on the time that it took to do something, right? Like a task, generate a document or pleading. And so one of the things that I focused on after reading these books was how do I increase my throughput, right? Like from in to out without more effort. Because I honestly at this time I was probably like I was working harder than I'd ever had in my life. And I was so stressed out. I had no time. And I was like, I literally cannot like outwork this problem. Like, so it's got to be something else. And that's another thing that I learned from these books, that you cannot outwork a bad business model. You have to change the business model. And so, I started kind of really focusing in on templates instead of like writing everything from scratch. How do I draft things in a way that I don't need to change everything? And so that's kind of, I don't want to skip ahead too far, but it's kind of where like Casely came in. But it really helps in scaling because, if you're, let's say if I'm doing something manually, let's say it takes me, I don't know, like in half an hour to draft a retainer agreement and sign a client and all that. That's you're not getting, especially on contingency, you're not getting paid for that, right? So on a contingency model, efficiency is really, really important. Because you don't get paid by the hour, or how much you work. And so I started, and then the more I focused on creating templates, the easier it was for my employee to do that work, because he's a staff, he's a legal secretary. All right, well, he's a paralegal, but he's not an attorney, so he can't draft things from scratch. But if I have templates for him, and then he can change the names and the dates, that really was big in scaling my firm.
Right. Awesome. Why don't we jump into that? Let's like dig into where this idea for Casey started. Maybe we'll start at the beginning of how we met. I guess you or I could tell the story.
Well, I've done a lot of talking. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, sure. Yeah. So a quick background of like myself. Like I was pretty technical kind of before Casely. So I actually ran a web design agency. So I was doing custom software for businesses, other, folks kind of like Fahim. And so I actually purchased an office just in front of where Fahim is, and then that's how we kind of met initially. So purely by chance, we just kind of got to talking. I learned a little bit of his background, and then that's I think where you had that need for like thinking of like how you can bring software in to your firm to help automate some stuff. And now at that point you were already using some software, right? Like you had some tools that you were using to do this templatized work.
So this is when around Chat GPT came out, and I was thinking, with AI, there should be some way that we can kind of leverage, instead of doing these templates. If I could just tell like an AI agent, be like, hey, draft me a retainer agreement for John Smith, and it just does it, that would be amazing. And so that's kind of what I had in my head. And then we started talking and kind of like fleshing that idea out, and that was kind of the birth of Casely.
Oh yeah. So why did you need to go for something like custom? Like why did you decide like, okay, I actually need to like build something out here because like ChatGPT is just missing the mark? Like where in your mind was it missing the mark?
So ChatGPT, I wouldn't say it was necessarily missing the mark, but it's not, it's not geared for attorneys. That means, and OpenAI, they say they don't train on your data, but we all know that's a lie. Of course they train on your data. And so, as an attorney, the biggest or the most important thing about the law, or, the practice of law, is confidentiality. It's like really, really, really important. And so, I didn't feel comfortable putting client information on ChatGPT or Claude or anything like that. I was very wary about uploading confidential information onto their servers. And so that's why, I was like, if we could build a proprietary AI where that's not a concern, it's super secure, that would be a game changer.
Yeah. So, obviously we've been working on Casey for a few months here. We've kind of deployed it into your firm.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can like talk a little bit about the life before and after really using Casely heavily in your firm. Like how long were you actually spending actually drafting these like demand letters, complaint pleadings before and after Casely?
Yeah. So a complaint usually took me like, in the beginning, it took me like a week, just gathering all the necessary information, meeting with clients, and I got as I did it more and more, I got better and better at it, and got quicker and more efficient. But I'm still like constrained by my human limitations of like how fast I can process all of these information and type it up. And so I had gotten it down to like 1 to 2 days, 3 days, I would say. It would take 3 days to draft a good complaint. But even that, as I was starting to get more and more clients, it would start being feasible. I can't spend 3 days on, or even 2 days on a complaint. And so with Casely, what's really cool is that if I do a really detailed intake at the outset, then Casey can use that information to automatically draft a demand letter or a complaint, within minutes. And that was honestly a huge, huge factor in me being able to scale my firm without without hiring an attorney.
That's my next question is like, without these kind of AI tools, like what would have been your options for trying to solve that problem, right?
Yeah, I don't think, it would have been possible without hiring somebody. I had already invested into hiring a paralegal, but a paralegal and an attorney, is night and day when it comes to compensation. I was really afraid. I was like, I cannot afford to to hire an attorney. I looked into it. I did some market research and I saw that for a first year attorney, the salary was around like the recommended salary was $90,000. And I was like, well, I can't afford it. I don't even know if I'm making $90,000 sitting here. You know what I mean? And at that point, I don't think I had cleared $90,000. Like I can't afford to hire somebody for $90,000. And so there was just, you know, it was just not that was just not a feasible path. And so I don't really know if what I would have done if it weren't for us being in, the 2020s and AI being a thing
Right.
and, developing Casely.
Do you think folks who are not using these AI tools, like even at the very, very large scale of firms, right, who have like the resources to, bring in talent like attorneys and teams of paralegals and legal assistants, do you think that there's a world where, small solo firms or even just like medium-sized firms can just outcompete them if they're using AI effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think they can. But the thing is, the so they can. Let me back up a little bit. But in law school, they taught us the practice of law,
Mhm.
but I didn't learn the economics of law until I started my own practice, and that's a whole different story. And so, it really depends on like what side of the aisle you're on. So, defense attorneys, they and defense firms, they bill by the hour, right? So they're almost like disincentivized to be efficient because they bill by the hour. So, if you use an AI tool to do something that takes you half an hour in 2 minutes, you're missing out on money theoretically, right? And so, but it's different for plaintiff's firm because we're on contingency. So I think, for a plaintiff's firm, if you're not using AI, you're really like you're setting yourself up for failure, honestly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Great. So let's talk a little bit more about like where we're kind of going, right? So we've got Casey in your firm. It's been kind of successful in your use case. You're also the chief product officer. So like, what are you thinking as far as like roadmap goes? Where do you see like the next kind of low hanging fruit? We've already kind of have documents being generated. Like, where else are we taking the product?
Yeah. So, one thing that's I think really lacking, and I think most attorneys will agree with me on this, is that most case management software is terrible. And so, and I've actually like, I've done demos with a lot of these companies. And the thing is that there's no like, it's kind of surprising because it's a really, really, I think it's like a couple $1 billion industry, but they all kind of like are bad and they just don't do everything that we need them to do. And I don't really know why. And so, what I'm envisioning for Casely is like once we get, the document stuff dialed in and we have, we're almost there. We have the beginning stages of a lawsuit, we have the demand letter, complaint, and then we're hammering out the discovery section. Discovery is pretty big, but once we do that, and that's kind of like the main substance stuff, what it really can do, or in my mind, what it should be able to do is just effective case management. So, for example, I have like 40 cases right now. I don't know what is going on in all 40 of my cases at any one time. I have to like look into the file, check my emails with opposing counsel. Otherwise, it's just impossible to know. Like if you ask me, like let's say I have a client, Joe Smith, hey, what's going on in Joe Smith's case? I can't tell you what's going on in Joe Smith's case. I have to look it up. And once, I open the emails and I look at the files, like, oh, this is the last thing that was filed. This is where we are. This is the last offer. Here's the good facts of his case. Here's the bad facts of his case. Then I could tell you, yeah, this is what's going on. I expect this to settle, in 3 months, or this is something that It's going to get litigated for years. And so, in my head, I have this vision for Casely where, if I go into a matter and be like, hey, what's going on with this case? You can tell me, it can tell me like, oh yeah, this is what's been done on this case. We've served discovery. We're waiting for responses. We have a CMC statement, a CMC hearing on this date next month, and opposing counsel's last offer was this much. And so, I think that would be really that's kind of like the ideal for Casey. Yeah, it does all this document generation stuff and makes the substantive law easier, but also makes the operational side of it easier. And operations is where a firm really can scale. That's the most, I think operations is kind of the X factor in like, if a firm can get their operations dialed in, that's the biggest key to scaling and profit. Yeah, I mean, so that's a loaded question. I don't know. But yeah, so I'm envisioning my firm scaling my firm to more of a trial firm. So most cases, most civil litigation firms are not trial firms, litigation firms, and that's because most cases, 98.5 cases of all cases settle. But the thing is, like, unless you can threaten a trial, yeah, unless you can do a trial, you're not going to get those good offers. And I'm not like I wouldn't say like I live. There's some attorneys that like live to be in trial, and I'm not one of those. But I like to be in trial. I think it's like the zenith of what we do as attorneys, as advocates, to convince a group of people that don't know your client, to convince them that they've been wronged and that they deserve justice. And that is something that I'm aspiring to grow my firm into. And with the help of Casely, handling some of the day-to-day tedious operational stuff, I can really focus on setting up my cases for trial.
Awesome. Appreciate you going through all that. If you were to give maybe one piece of advice to someone thinking of starting their own firm, what would that be?
I guess the one piece of advice would be to just take the leap. I've talked to a lot of people that say, I really want to do that, but I don't have the money. I don't have enough savings. I'm hoping to save like another year or, X amount of years or X amount of dollars before I take that leap. And the thing is that what I've seen is that it never becomes enough, right? Like it's almost like a limiting factor where someone's like, if I had a little bit more, I'd feel comfortable, a little bit more. But the thing is, like, life just gets more and more expensive. Like, life never gets cheaper. You know what I mean? So, and then, these people, like, they end up never doing it. And the thing is that, like, for me personally, I started this firm with very little money, and I thought that was a disadvantage to, versus people that did have, a lot of money or a lot of cushion, right? But and yes, it was, of course. I had to be a lot leaner, and there were some, I couldn't take as many risks as someone that had more of a cushion. But I also learned that it was kind of a strength in that, like, it forced me to be incredibly resourceful. Like, I wouldn't have created, or we wouldn't have created Casely without it, because there was such a need for me to, optimize my workflow. And so, like, let's say, if there was somebody just like me in the exact same position, but with, like, $100,000, they would probably hire somebody, right? They would hire somebody, they would hire staff, and they can go that way. But me being extremely lean, it forced me to be super super resourceful and try to solve problems in a cost effective manner. And I think that probably made me who I am today because of the lessons that I had to learn. And honestly, before I became a business owner and like had this firm, I was pretty terrible with spending habits and finances in general. But I've gotten a lot better, and my wife will attest to that. But yeah, so I guess my one piece of advice would be, just take the leap, and like, you learn, right? There's this book called, like, The Obstacle Is the Way, and it's about, like, stoicism, and it's kind of true, right? Like, you like, as someone with a fledgling business, the number one thing was that I had to answer, like, the question I had to answer, like, okay, how am I gonna survive to tomorrow? And then, like, you get better, like, you learn, like, okay, so you try different things, and you learn, like, okay, this didn't work, so I'm gonna do this. Well, that didn't work, so I'm gonna do this. Well, this works, so I'm gonna keep doing this. right? And then, you get a little bit better, more and more efficient every day. And then, next thing you know, you have a successful business. That's not to say it's not hard. It's incredibly difficult, but you kind of gotta persist and learn and be humble. It was an incredibly humbling experience for me because I realized like I had no idea what I was doing, so I had to go back to my roots and read, learn from people that have done this and is much more successful than I am. And then just not only read, just like apply those lessons, because I've recommended a lot of these books to a lot of people and they haven't. I don't think it did them any good, honestly, because they didn't apply the lessons that they learned. So yeah, so I guess my number one advice would be like, keep an open mind and take the leap and stick through it. I know it's easier said than done, but yeah, that's pretty much it.
Appreciate you taking the time, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
All right. See ya.
Yeah.